Darren had always been a man of routine. Every morning, he woke up early, grabbed a cup of coffee, and headed to his small workshop. The building was tucked away on a quiet street in the heart of the city, where only a few locals knew about the hidden gem of an engineering shop. Darren had been fixing things for years. Machines, gadgets, anything with wires and gears. His reputation had spread, but he preferred to keep his business simple, quiet, and steady. There was something comforting about the predictable hum of his work. On that particular morning, the world outside Darren's workshop was anything but predictable. It all started when a low rumble shook the ground, followed by a loud whoosh of air. Darren looked up from the engine he was working on, wiping his hands on a rag. His first thought was that a heavy truck had driven past, but the shaking continued, far stronger than anything a truck could cause. The sound grew louder, like thunder in the sky, but the skies were clear. Curious and slightly concerned, Darren stepped outside. The street was eerily quiet, and then he saw it. A large metallic object was descending slowly from the sky, its shape unlike anything he had ever seen. It looked like a ship, but it wasn't a typical human-made aircraft. The ship had smooth curves and glowing lights that pulsed rhythmically. It landed with a soft thud in an empty parking lot, leaving a small crater in the ground. Darren's heart raced as he stood frozen, staring at the craft. It wasn't just any plane or drone. It was something from another world. The ship was alien. Before Darren could even process what had happened, the door to the ship opened with a hissing sound. A figure emerged, stepping down the small ramp. At first, Darren couldn't see much due to the brightness of the lights, but as the figure drew closer, he could make out more details. She was tall, at least 6 feet, with smooth, pale skin that shimmered faintly under the sunlight. Her hair was a silvery white, flowing down in waves, and her eyes were a deep shade of violet, unlike anything Darren had ever seen. She wore a sleek, form-fitting suit that looked both advanced and practical, with markings Darren couldn't read. "Hello," she said in a voice that was clear but with a slight accent. The words were in English, but there was something otherworldly about them, as though the sound itself was not quite from Earth. "I need assistance." Darren blinked, his mouth dry. Was this really happening? Was he dreaming? The woman in front of him was an alien. An actual alien. He had read about them, heard rumors, but seeing one in person, standing right in front of him, was beyond anything he could have imagined. "Assistance," Darren managed to say, his voice cracking a bit. He cleared his throat. "With what?" The alien's eyes flicked to his workshop behind him, then back to him. "I need a rare component. A part for my ship. Your planet has it." Darren frowned. "My planet?" He felt dizzy. "What do you mean?" "I am from a distant place," she said. "I have traveled far to find this part. The one who can help me is you. I've studied your work. I know you are the best." Darren looked around, trying to make sense of the situation. Was he really being asked to help an alien? But he didn't have time to question it further. The woman's eyes, those intense violet eyes, were fixed on him, waiting for his response. "All right," Darren said, though he still couldn't believe what was happening. "I can help. But first, let's take a look at your ship and figure out exactly what you need." The alien nodded and turned to lead him back toward her craft. Darren followed, still trying to wrap his mind around everything. How had she come to Earth? Why was she asking him, a simple engineer, for help? He was just a guy who fixed engines and machines. He wasn't a space expert or anything. As they approached the ship, Darren's mind raced with questions. The ship's surface was smooth and metallic, unlike anything human technology had produced. It almost seemed to shimmer with a strange energy. He could see that it wasn't damaged on the outside, but there were sections that seemed to pulse with light, as though the ship itself was alive. He had no idea what kind of technology he was looking at, but there was no denying that this was beyond anything Earth had ever seen. The woman stepped inside the ship, and Darren followed her, taking careful steps. The inside was just as strange, with curved walls and glowing panels. It felt almost like stepping into a dream, a place so foreign and beautiful that it was hard to believe it was real. "This is my ship," the woman said, gesturing around her. "I need a specific component to repair the engines. Without it, I cannot leave." Darren nodded. "Okay, I'll see what I can do, but I need more information. What exactly am I looking for? And what kind of part is it?" The woman paused, her violet eyes studying him. "It is a rare energy converter, built to withstand extreme conditions. It's made from a combination of materials that your planet doesn't yet fully understand. I've been searching for it for many years." Darren looked at her, trying to imagine what kind of technology would require such a complex part. "I don't know if we have that here, but I'll look into it. Can you tell me more about the materials you need?" The woman smiled. "I knew you would be the one to help. I've studied your kind, Darren. You are resourceful." Darren's heart skipped a beat. "You know my name." "I know much about you," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I had to learn about your people, your technology. I knew this day would come." Darren was stunned. This alien knew about him, about Earth. It felt like the beginning of something huge, something that could change everything he had ever known. "Well then," he said, forcing a small smile, "let's get started. I'll do what I can." The woman's eyes softened as she looked at him. "Thank you, Darren." And with that, the unlikely partnership between a human engineer and an alien began. Neither of them knew how much this encounter would change their lives. The following days passed in a blur for Darren. At first, the idea of helping an alien seemed like an impossible task, something that could only happen in a sci-fi movie. But there he was, working side by side with Lyra, the alien who had landed on Earth looking for a rare part to fix her ship. It wasn't just the strange technology that surrounded him, but the very presence of Lyra that made everything feel surreal. They worked together in Darren's workshop, which had become more of a makeshift laboratory. The usual smell of oil and metal was now mixed with the faint scent of something foreign, something like fresh rain on a distant planet. Lyra had insisted on helping Darren with the search for the part, and although her knowledge of human technology was limited, she showed an unexpected understanding of machinery. Her hands moved with precision, adjusting pieces of equipment, and Darren was amazed by how quickly she picked things up. It was as though she had an innate ability to learn whatever she needed, and it made him question just how advanced her civilization must be. They spent hours together, sometimes in silence, other times discussing ideas and possibilities. Lyra didn't talk much about herself, but Darren learned a few things through their conversations. She was from a distant star system, one so far away that even the most advanced human telescopes couldn't spot it. Her people were explorers, traveling through the galaxy to study and understand different worlds. She wasn't a soldier or a diplomat, but an engineer, just like Darren. As the days passed, Darren began to notice little things. The way Lyra's violet eyes would flicker when she was deep in thought, how her voice softened when she spoke of her home, and how her body seemed to relax around him. He wasn't sure if it was the long hours spent working together or if there was something else, but he couldn't deny the growing bond between them. It wasn't just the work, there was something more. Lyra, for her part, had always kept her emotions in check. It was part of her training as an explorer, not to get too attached to the places or people she encountered. But Darren was different. She had always admired the creativity and resourcefulness of humans, but she hadn't expected to find someone like him. Someone who could so easily understand the complexities of her world, even though he had never been outside of Earth. He was patient, intelligent, and, despite his initial hesitation, open-minded. She also noticed how his presence made her feel a little less lonely. Being on Earth, surrounded by people who were unaware of the vastness of the universe, had made her feel disconnected. But when Darren spoke to her, it felt like she wasn't so alone anymore. There was something about him that made her feel safe, even though she knew she should have been focusing on her mission. One afternoon, as they worked on trying to find the right materials for the part, Darren took a break and sat down on an old crate. Lyra was busy examining a piece of the ship's engine, her brow furrowed in concentration. Darren watched her for a moment, admiring her focus. He had never met anyone so determined, and it made him wonder about her life beyond this mission. "Lyra," he asked, his voice casual but sincere, "what's it like where you're from? Your planet, I mean." Lyra didn't look up right away, but Darren could see the subtle change in her posture. It wasn't like she was avoiding the question, but it was clear that the topic wasn't one she brought up often. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but carrying a hint of warmth. "My world is peaceful. At least it was when I left. We value knowledge and exploration. Our society is built on discovery, not conquest. We believe in understanding other cultures, learning from them, and sharing what we know. It's not perfect, but it's home." Darren nodded, impressed by her words. It sounded so different from Earth's often chaotic history. That's amazing. We could learn a lot from you." Lyra paused for a moment, then gave a small smile. "Perhaps, but your people have something special too. You see the world differently. Your curiosity, your drive to improve. It's something that many of us admire." Darren wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he just smiled back. He hadn't expected to have such a deep conversation, but it was moments like these that made him realize just how much he was learning from her and how much she had to offer. Over the next few days, the tension between them started to change. What began as a professional relationship, grounded in the shared goal of repairing her ship, slowly evolved into something more personal. They would talk during breaks, sharing stories of their lives, their hopes, and their dreams. Darren found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone in years. He told her about his childhood, his love of machines, and the way he always felt like something was missing, like there was a bigger purpose out there for him, even if he couldn't figure out what it was. Lyra, in turn, shared bits and pieces of her life, though she was careful not to reveal too much. She told him about her travels to other worlds, her fascination with human inventions, and her longing to return home. But there was always something she held back, a part of herself she kept locked away. One evening, as they worked under the dim light of the workshop, Darren looked up from his work to find Lyra watching him. Her violet eyes were intense, but there was a softness to them that hadn't been there before. She seemed almost vulnerable, as if she were struggling with something inside herself. "Is something wrong?" Darren asked, his voice quiet. Lyra hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "No, nothing is wrong. I never expected to find someone like you here on Earth." Darren felt his heart race a little. "What do you mean?" "You're different," she said simply. "You've shown me things I didn't know I needed to see. You've made me question things I thought I understood. It's strange." For the first time, Darren realized just how much he had come to care for her. There was something about her, something in the way she looked at him, in the way she trusted him, that made him feel like they shared something that couldn't be easily explained. It wasn't just about fixing machines anymore. And as much as Darren tried to ignore the growing feelings inside him, he couldn't help but wonder what might come of this unexpected bond. The following week, Darren and Lyra had settled into a routine. The days were long, filled with hours spent tinkering with the alien ship, trying to find the rare part that would allow Lyra to fix the damage to her engine. While Darren was usually the one leading the technical work, Lyra had become an invaluable partner. Her knowledge of technology from across the stars was both baffling and awe-inspiring, but it was also clear that she wasn't familiar with the specific resources on Earth. It was up to Darren to gather the materials they needed. One evening, after another long day of trial and error, Darren sat at his workbench, flipping through old manuals and trying to make sense of the notes Lyra had shared with him. He'd hoped to find a solution to the missing part, but his progress had been slow. The part they needed was made from a combination of materials that weren't native to Earth. Lyra had mentioned that it was a rare energy converter, one that could handle the extreme power demands of her ship's engines. It was a delicate balance of metals and energy-efficient components that Earth had yet to discover. "I think I've found a lead," Darren muttered, staring at the old blueprint in front of him. "But I'm not sure if it'll be enough." Lyra, who had been working quietly beside him, looked up. Her eyes, the brilliant violet that always seemed to carry a deep, thoughtful quality, were focused on him. "What is it?" Darren looked over at her. "There's a small chance that the material we need could be located in a nearby scrapyard. It's a long shot, but it's the best lead we have." Lyra's face lit up, but then her expression turned thoughtful. "A scrapyard?" she repeated. "How do we know it's even there?" "Well, it's not a certainty," Darren said, standing up and stretching his legs. "But it's the closest thing to what we're looking for. If we're lucky, we might find a scrap piece of machinery that has the right energy properties." Lyra hesitated for a moment as though weighing the risk. Then she gave a firm nod. "Then we'll go." The scrapyard was located on the outskirts of town, a few miles away from Darren's workshop. It was a place filled with old vehicles, broken machinery, and discarded technology. Nothing too valuable by most people's standards. But for Darren and Lyra, it was the perfect hunting ground. They had no idea what kind of hidden treasures they might find, but they were willing to try. As they arrived at the scrapyard, the place felt even more vast and chaotic than Darren remembered. Metal and debris were piled high, and the air smelled of oil, rust, and dust. He took a deep breath, trying to ignore the overwhelming sense of disorder. "We'll start here," Darren said, pointing to a large pile of discarded electronics. "If we find anything resembling the material we need, we can start testing it right away." Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the piles. There was a sense of urgency in the way she moved, and Darren couldn't help but admire her determination. The task at hand wasn't easy, and with every passing hour, Lyra's hope seemed to diminish. She had always been resourceful, but this world, Earth, was so different from the advanced societies she had encountered. She had spent most of her life traveling through space, yet now she found herself struggling with the simplest of challenges. As they began sifting through the pile of materials, Darren noticed that Lyra's frustration was starting to show. Her movements became quicker, more frantic. Her breathing, once steady, was now shallow, and he could sense the weight of the situation pressing on her. "I'm sorry," Lyra said, pausing and turning toward him. "I didn't expect this to be so difficult." Darren looked up, surprised. "It's okay," he reassured her. "We knew it wouldn't be easy. We'll find something, I'm sure of it." Lyra gave a small nod, though the doubt in her eyes lingered. "I've never had to rely on this kind of search before. I've always had access to advanced technologies and resources. This is different." Darren smiled. "I get it, but that's what makes it interesting, right? We're learning something new." Lyra managed a soft laugh. "You're right. You humans are resilient." They worked in silence for a while longer, their movements synchronized as they carefully searched through the scrap heap. The sky was beginning to turn a soft pink as the sun began to set, and Darren was starting to feel the weight of the day. He glanced at Lyra, who was still focused on the task at hand. There was something about her calm determination that he found admirable. Despite the uncertainty and the exhaustion, she was still willing to press on. Just as Darren was about to give up for the day, he heard a sharp gasp from Lyra. He quickly turned around to find her crouched beside a pile of old equipment, her hand resting on a large piece of metal that seemed to emit a faint glow. "I think I've found it," Lyra said, her voice filled with surprise. Darren rushed over, his heart pounding. The object she was holding was unlike anything he had ever seen. It wasn't like any part of human technology. It had smooth, iridescent surfaces that seemed to shimmer as though alive. He couldn't quite explain it, but it felt like they had just stumbled upon something extraordinary. "What is it?" Darren asked, his voice filled with awe. Lyra ran her fingers over the object, carefully inspecting it. This is close to what we need. It's a power converter, but it's not the exact model. It's a prototype, something that was never fully developed. Darren's excitement faded slightly. So it's not perfect. No, Lyra admitted, her brow furrowing. But it's the closest thing we have. We'll need to modify it, but I think we can make it work. Darren smiled, feeling a rush of relief. That's great. We'll make it work. With the piece in hand, they headed back to the workshop, exhausted but with a renewed sense of purpose. Lyra had been right to trust Darren, and Darren felt more confident than ever that they could get her ship back into working order. But as they worked, Darren couldn't shake the feeling that this journey was about more than just fixing an alien ship. Something had shifted between them, a bond that went beyond the technical challenges they had faced together. And though neither of them could quite put it into words, Darren had a feeling that their story was just beginning. The following days felt like a whirlwind for Darren and Lyra. The prototype part they had found in the scrapyard wasn't perfect, but it was a promising start. Darren spent hours in his workshop with Lyra, carefully modifying the piece. There were times when things went wrong. Tools would malfunction, wires wouldn't connect, and sparks would fly from the makeshift circuits they were building. But through it all, Lyra remained calm and focused, and Darren admired her for it. The more time they spent together, the more Darren noticed how comfortable he had become around her. It wasn't just the shared work, it was the way she made him feel understood. Lyra wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. She wasn't just an alien. She was intelligent, thoughtful, and deeply curious about the world around her. They spent hours talking not just about the mission, but about their lives, their hopes, and even the small things, like the food they liked, the books they read, or the way the stars looked in the sky. It wasn't long before Darren realized that his feelings for Lyra had changed. What had started as a simple partnership had turned into something deeper. There was a part of him that felt drawn to her strength, her intelligence, and the way she seemed to understand things without needing to explain them. And when they laughed together, when they shared stories, it felt as though they had always known each other. One evening, after another long day of working on the ship, Darren sat back, wiping the sweat from his brow. Lyra was sitting across from him, her head bent over a complicated blueprint, her fingers gently tracing the lines. For a moment, Darren just watched her, his thoughts drifting. "You know," Darren said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking." Lyra looked up, raising an eyebrow. "About what?" "About this." He gestured around the workshop. "About everything that's happened. I mean, when I first met you, I thought you were just some stranger who needed help fixing a ship. Now it feels like we've been through a lot together." Lyra's expression softened, and she put the blueprint down. "I feel the same way. When I first arrived on Earth, I was focused on the mission. Everything else was secondary. But now, after working with you, She paused, her violet eyes searching Darren's face. "I feel different too. You've made me see things in a new way. Things I didn't know I needed to see." Darren's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure how to respond, but something inside him told him that the bond they had formed was stronger than either of them realized. He leaned forward slightly. "I'm glad I'm not the only one feeling that way." Lyra smiled, but there was something behind her eyes, something unspoken. Darren couldn't tell if she was hesitating or just choosing her words carefully. But before he could say anything more, she stood up, her gaze shifting to the door of the workshop. "We've made progress," Lyra said, her voice steady, though there was a hint of emotion hiding beneath it. "But we're not done yet. There's still a lot of work to do." Darren nodded, not wanting to push her further. He understood that she was still focused on her mission, and he didn't want to distract her. Yet, the thought of Lyra leaving still lingered in the back of his mind. Once the ship was fixed, would she go back to the stars? Would they ever see each other again? "Yeah," he said, trying to sound casual. "There's still a lot to figure out." The next day, Darren and Lyra continued their work with renewed energy. The power converter was now almost fully functional, and they were working on the last few modifications. There was still one more piece of technology they needed to secure: an advanced energy source that could power the ship once the converter was installed. This part was more difficult to find, and Darren knew they might have to travel further than they had before. They took a break in the late afternoon, sitting on the steps outside the workshop, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange as the sun began to set. The air was cool and calm, and for a moment, it felt as though nothing in the world could interrupt the peace they had found in each other's company. "I've been thinking," Lyra began, her voice quiet. "Once the ship is fixed, I'll have to leave. My people will need me, and I can't stay on Earth forever." Darren felt his stomach tighten at the thought, but he didn't want to show it. He knew this day would come eventually, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. He had gotten used to having Lyra around, more than he had ever expected. "I know," he replied softly. "But I understand. Your mission is important. You can't just stay here forever." Lyra's eyes searched his face, her expression a mix of sadness and understanding. "I didn't expect to form a connection like this with you. But now, I don't know how to say goodbye. It's strange. I never thought I'd feel this way about a human." Darren smiled faintly. "I get it. I never imagined this would happen either." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them seemed to hum with something unspoken, a quiet understanding that neither could fully express. Darren wanted to reach out, to say more, but something held him back. Lyra was still an alien, someone from a distant star system, and there were things about her life that he would never fully understand. But despite the distance, both physical and emotional, that existed between them, Darren couldn't ignore the pull he felt. There was something undeniable between them, a connection that went beyond the practicalities of fixing a ship. He just wasn't sure what it meant yet. The evening passed in a comfortable silence. They returned to the workshop to finish their work, but the air between them had shifted. Whatever had been brewing between them, whatever feelings had started to grow, now seemed clearer than ever. But Darren knew that there were still so many questions left unanswered. What would happen when the ship was repaired? Would Lyra leave and return to the stars? Or would they find a way to stay connected, despite the vast distance between their worlds? Only time would tell. But for now, they worked together, side by side, knowing that whatever came next, they had formed a bond that neither of them could ignore. The days passed in a steady rhythm. Darren and Lyra continued to work together on her ship, the power converter nearly ready for installation. Every time Darren thought they were close, a new challenge would arise. But with each challenge, their bond deepened. What had started as an unexpected partnership had grown into something far more significant. The most obvious sign of their growing connection was the ease with which they worked together. Lyra had started to trust Darren's instincts, and he had learned to appreciate the depth of her knowledge, even though it sometimes came from another world. They would joke together, share moments of frustration, and laugh when things didn't go as planned. It was becoming a routine for them, a routine that felt almost normal. One afternoon, as they were tightening a set of bolts on the side of the ship, Darren noticed something about Lyra. She was looking at him in a way she hadn't before. Something soft, something searching. It made his heart race in a way he hadn't expected. "What is it?" Darren asked, wiping his hands on a rag as he noticed her gaze. Lyra looked at him, her violet eyes studying him. She hesitated for a moment, her lips parting as if she were going to speak. Then she stopped. She seemed to be weighing her words, her usual confidence suddenly wavering. "Darren," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." Darren felt his chest tighten. He had been expecting this moment, the moment when the realities of their situation would pull them in different directions. "What is it?" Lyra started, then took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about what happens after this, after the ship is fixed. I have my mission. I have my people. I'm not sure I can stay on Earth. But I don't want to leave things unsaid between us. I don't want to leave and have regrets. Darren's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized how much he had been dreading this moment. He had been so focused on helping Lyra, so absorbed in their shared work, that he hadn't allowed himself to think about the future. What would happen when her ship was ready? What would happen when she had to leave? Lyra, he began, but his voice faltered. He didn't know what to say. The truth was, he didn't want her to leave. He had grown too close to her, and the thought of watching her go seemed unbearable. But he didn't want to pressure her either. He knew that her mission was important, and she couldn't just abandon it for him. Lyra took a step closer to him, her hand reaching out. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. I want you to know that what we've shared, this time together, it means more to me than I can put into words. I didn't expect any of this. I didn't expect to form such a connection with a human. But now I'm not sure what's going to happen. Darren placed his hand gently over hers, his pulse quickening. I didn't expect it either, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect to care about you like this. There was a long pause between them, and for a moment, the world outside the workshop seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, standing in the quiet of the evening, with nothing but the soft hum of the ship's systems in the background. I don't know what's going to happen either, Lyra said after a while, her voice tinged with sadness. But I don't want to say goodbye without knowing how I really feel. Darren's heart ached at her words. He knew what she meant. The bond they had formed wasn't something either of them had anticipated, but it was real. And the thought of her leaving without understanding what they had, it didn't sit well with him. I think I've figured out how I feel, Darren said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I don't want to lose you. I don't want this to end. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, as though looking for the truth in his words. She took a step closer, closing the distance between them. Her hand, still in his, tightened slightly. The moment felt electric, charged with something neither of them could quite explain. I don't want to lose you either, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Darren leaned in slightly, his face inches from hers. He had never been this close to someone like this before. And the strange thing was, he wasn't scared. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was willing to find out. Whatever the future held, he knew that he didn't want to face it without her. Slowly, cautiously, he leaned in just a little bit more. Their foreheads touched, the warmth of Lyra's skin against his feeling like the most natural thing in the world. I think we need to talk more about this, Darren said softly, pulling back slightly to look at her face. I think we need to figure out what happens next. Lyra nodded, her eyes still locked on his. Yes, I think we do. The moment lingered between them, full of unspoken words, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was a quiet understanding. Neither of them knew what the future would bring, but in that moment, they knew they were on the same path. And that was enough. Later that evening, Darren and Lyra sat down together at a small table in the workshop. They didn't talk much about the ship or the repairs. They didn't need to. Instead, they talked about their hopes, their dreams, and what their lives might look like when the ship was finally ready to go. Lyra shared stories of her travels, of the planets she had visited, and the people she had met. Darren listened intently, fascinated by her tales. He had always thought of space as a distant, cold place, but hearing Lyra's stories made it seem not so far away. It felt more like something he could be a part of, something he could share with her. I never thought I'd be here, Lyra said, her voice thoughtful as she looked out the window at the darkening sky. On Earth. With you. Darren smiled softly. I never thought I'd be working on an alien spaceship either, but I'm glad I am. Me too, Lyra said, turning back to him with a smile. Me too. The days seemed to fly by. Darren and Lyra's work on the ship was nearing completion, and they could both feel the weight of what was coming. The power converter was now fully functional. The systems were starting to align, and the ship was almost ready for takeoff. But in the quiet moments, when they weren't working, it was impossible to ignore the growing tension between them. Darren spent more time thinking about the future. Lyra's mission, her people, the stars. They were all a part of her life that Darren would never truly be a part of. And yet, in the time they had spent together, a deep bond had formed, one that he couldn't ignore. It was more than just a passing connection. It felt like a part of him had changed in a way he couldn't explain. But no matter how he felt, Darren knew that Lyra had to make a choice. The mission was her responsibility, and the call of her people was strong. The ship would be ready soon, and that meant her time on Earth was coming to an end. It was late one evening when Darren found himself sitting on the edge of a workbench, staring at the blueprint of the ship in front of him. The workshop was quiet except for the faint hum of the ship's systems and the occasional click of a tool. He could hear Lyra moving around in the background, making small adjustments to the ship's control panel. He took a deep breath, trying to focus. But his mind kept wandering back to the same thought. What would happen when she left? What would happen to them? Lyra stepped into his line of sight, her footsteps light on the floor. She had been working tirelessly for days, and Darren could see the exhaustion in her eyes. But there was also something else, something deeper. She looked at him for a moment, her gaze soft, but there was a trace of something unspoken. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her voice gentle. Darren didn't look up immediately. He was lost in thought, his fingers tracing the edge of the blueprint absent-mindedly. "I've been thinking," he replied, his voice low. "About what?" "About everything," he said, finally looking up at her. "About you, about the ship, about us." Lyra's expression softened, and she took a step closer. "I know. I've been thinking about it too." Darren stood up from the workbench, his eyes meeting hers. "Lyra, I need to ask you something. When the ship is ready, what happens next? What happens to us?" She paused, her lips parting slightly, as if she were about to speak but wasn't sure what to say. Darren's heart pounded in his chest. He needed answers, needed to know what to expect. The uncertainty had been eating at him for days. "I don't know," Lyra finally admitted, her voice soft. "I've been trying to figure that out myself." Darren felt a mix of frustration and sadness. "You're going to leave, aren't you? Once the ship is ready, you'll go back to your people, to your mission. You'll forget about me." Lyra's eyes flashed with something, hurt, maybe, or regret. She shook her head. "No, it's not that simple. I don't want to leave you. But my mission, my people, they need me. I can't just stay here." Darren's chest tightened. He had known this was coming, but hearing it from her still stung. He understood, logically, that her mission was important, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. The bond they had formed, was it enough to overcome the distance between their worlds? Or was it just a fleeting connection, something that would fade when she left? "Then what are we supposed to do?" Darren asked, his voice trembling slightly. "You want me to just let you go? Pretend nothing happened?" Lyra stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "No, Darren. I don't want to pretend. I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am about how I feel for you. But the reality is," she paused, her gaze falling to the floor for a moment, "I have a responsibility. To my people. To my mission." Darren swallowed hard, trying to push down the feeling of helplessness rising within him. "I know," he said quietly, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "I understand. I just—" He stopped, not knowing what else to say. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes soft but full of emotion. "Darren, this isn't easy for me. I never thought I would feel this way. I never thought I would want to stay. But I can't. My duty calls, and I can't abandon it." Darren took a step back, his thoughts spinning. The distance between them seemed to grow, even though they were standing only a few feet apart. He knew that Lyra was torn. He could see it in her eyes, hear it in her voice. but he also knew that there was nothing he could do to change her mind. "I wish things were different," Darren said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wish we could have more time." Lyra nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Me too. But sometimes we don't get to choose what happens next. Sometimes the choices are made for us." Darren ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady himself. "So, what now?" "We finished the ship," Lyra said softly, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "We finish what we started. And when the time comes, we say goodbye. The way it has to be." Darren nodded slowly, unable to find the words. The thought of saying goodbye, of losing her, was unbearable. But he also knew that this was her life. She had a duty to fulfill. He couldn't ask her to stay. The rest of the evening passed in a quiet haze. They worked side by side, the tension between them thick but unspoken. There was no easy answer, no simple solution. Only the inevitable truth that Lyra's mission would eventually pull her away. And when the ship was finally ready, Darren would have to let her go. The day had arrived. The ship was finally ready. All the systems were checked, the repairs completed, and the power converter that Darren had worked on with Lyra for weeks was now fully functional. The humming of the engines filled the air, a steady rhythm that signaled the ship was ready to take off. But for Darren and Lyra, this day wasn't just about the ship. It was about everything they had shared, everything that had led them to this moment. Darren stood outside the workshop, staring up at the ship. The stars above seemed so distant, so far away. He had always looked up at them with curiosity, with wonder. But now, they seemed to mock him, reminding him of the separation that lay ahead. Lyra's time on Earth was coming to an end. The mission that had brought her here would soon pull her back to her people, to her world. And Darren, standing there alone, had to come to terms with that reality. He could feel the weight of the decision on his shoulders, the choice he had to make. He had always known that this moment would come, but knowing it and living through it were two very different things. He had spent the last few days thinking about everything, about Lyra, about their connection, about the future. And now, as the time to say goodbye loomed closer, Darren found himself torn. "I never thought it would be this hard," he whispered to himself. The sound of footsteps behind him brought him back to the present. Lyra approached, her silhouette framed by the light from the workshop. She was wearing the same uniform she had worn the first time they met. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a uniform. It was a symbol of the life she had to return to. The life that didn't include him. "Darren," she said, her voice soft but steady. "It's time." He turned to face her, his heart aching at the sight of her. She looked beautiful, more than he had ever imagined. But there was also sadness in her eyes, a sadness that mirrored his own. "I know," Darren said, his voice tight. He had known this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. "It's just, I don't know what to do." Lyra stepped closer, her expression softening. "You don't have to do anything. You've already done more than I ever expected. You helped me fix my ship. You helped me in ways I can never repay. And I don't know what to say to make this easier." Darren swallowed, his throat dry. "I don't want you to leave. I want to stay with you." Lyra's heart ached at his words, and for a moment, she was speechless. She had felt the same way. She had wanted to stay, to be with him. But her duty, her mission, was too great. She couldn't abandon her people, and she couldn't abandon the responsibility that came with being part of something bigger than herself. "I don't want to leave either," Lyra admitted quietly. "But my people need me. My mission doesn't end here. I have to go back. I wish I could change that." Darren nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. He had always known that this day would come, but it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. He had fallen in love with her, and now he had to let her go. The thought of it crushed him. "I know," Darren said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never thought it would hurt this much." Lyra reached out, gently touching his arm. I never thought it would either. But sometimes life isn't about what we want. It's about what we have to do. The silence between them felt heavy, like the weight of the entire universe was pressing down on them. Neither of them spoke for a moment, both of them lost in their own thoughts, their own emotions. Finally, Lyra spoke again, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Darren, I want you to know that what we had here, this time together, it will always be a part of me. I will carry it with me wherever I go. And maybe someday our paths will cross again. But for now, I have to go. Darren closed his eyes, feeling the tears threatening to fall. He had never imagined that letting go would feel like this, but as much as he wanted to hold on to her, he knew that he had to let her go. He had to let her fulfill her mission, to follow her destiny, even if it meant losing her. I'll never forget you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Lyra smiled softly, a tear slipping down her cheek. I'll never forget you either, Darren. For a moment, they stood there, the world around them fading away. It was just the two of them, locked in a moment of quiet understanding. And then, without another word, Lyra turned and began to walk toward the ship. Darren watched her go, his heart heavy, his body numb. As Lyra boarded the ship, she turned back to look at him one last time. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as if the entire universe stood still. But then, with a final nod, she turned and disappeared inside. Darren stood there, staring at the ship for a long time after she had gone. The stars above him seemed distant, unreachable. But in his heart, he carried something with him, something that would stay with him forever. He had loved her, and that, at least, was something he could hold on to. The ship's engines roared to life, and within moments, it began to rise into the night sky. Darren watched as it ascended, disappearing into the stars, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace.